Okay. Thank you all for tuning in, and it's my pleasure to introduce our summer intern, Emily Woods. Emily Woods lives in Castlewood, just graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in animal and poultry science, and seems to have an especial interest in the equine, I believe. I think that's fair to say. Uh, but she's going to be talking to us a bit about um, equine basics for first-time horse owners. So, Emily, it's yours.
Thank you. Um, so I'm Emily Woods. Most of my work at Tech was done with horses. So I grew up around horses and being with them, and then went to Tech. They made most of my coursework. Oh, 1 second, I think. Okay, I'm struggling to get my screen to share now. It worked earlier. Let's see. Okay, it should be working now. I apologize for that.
All right, it's working.
Perfect. Okay, so I did this basically, like Phil said, for a first-time horse owner. So some of this you might already know or you might not. That's great. Either way, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. A lot of people have a lot of different ways of doing things. So this is just more so the way that I've always done it, the way I've kind of learned to do it. So you could hear a couple different things depending on who you talk to. But most of this I tried to make the core things that you're going to hear across the board. So this is my horse, Apache. So before you buy, if you already have a horse, then this is a little irrelevant. But if not, this is one of the more important things to think about right off is what you want your horse to do for you. So whether that's going to be trail riding, or if you want to compete, what discipline you're doing, are you going to be doing Western pleasure? Is it hunter jumper? Whatever that's going to be is going to determine a little bit of what you're going to be looking for. So, and that also might determine a little bit of your price range. If you want a horse that's going to be a weekend trail horse, that you might be looking for different things. And if you want it to go out and show competitively jumping or in the hunter ring or something like that. And then also think a little bit about how much experience you have. So this, whether or not this is the first horse you've owned, doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have riding experience. So you might have grown up riding, or you might have taken lessons from someone else. So all that kind of determines whether you want a horse that might be a little bit of a challenge that you can grow with, or if you want a dead broke bomb-proof horse, which I personally still prefer. I mostly trail ride. So I much prefer someone who I know every time I get on is going to give me that same ride every time. So depending on what you're looking for, across the board, a pre-purchase exam is always a pretty good idea. So what that's going to be is your vet's going to come out and you're just going to have them look all over that horse. They're going to palpate all over the horse. They're going to make sure that they're in good physical condition. They're going to lameness test the horse to make sure that they can perform correctly. So they're going to put the hoof testers on. They're going to go over, they're going to flex the horse and basically just see, they're going to catch some things that, especially if you haven't bought a horse before, that can be a little harder to catch. So signs of previous injury, signs of mild lamenesses, and then you're going to have a much better idea of whether this horse is going to be able to do the job that you're buying it to do. So once you get it, a couple of the things you really have to think of first is where are you going to put it. So you might have the land, you might not. Pasture, stall, whether you're going to have it on your own property if you have that option, or where you're going to board it. So each horse, and this is actually law in some areas, I'm not sure about Kentucky at all, but I know at least some areas there's the law that each horse has to have an acre of pasture, and really that's about as much as you can comfortably keep one on, especially if you're planning that they're going to get most of their nutrition from the grass in that pasture. I always think like 2 is a little better. It just gives the grass a little bit more time to rest and reset and keeps it from grazing down too far. So the basic rule of thumb is if your grass is 3 inches tall, then that horse isn't really going to be able to use it. That's, if it gets any lower than that, it's really considered overgrazed. It needs to rest, and then it needs to be able to grow back up before that horse can really graze and get much nutrition out of that field. So if you have a horse that's going to be on turnout 24/7, that's great. My horse has always been boarded on pasture, but just make sure that the pasture is going to provide the space and then the grass that they need. So if they're in the stall, consider turnout. Are they going to be out during the day, out during the night? Is it going to be seasonal? Maybe they're out more in the summer, maybe they stay in more during the winter. So those are just things to look at and consider, and that depends a little bit more on your horse and on your facilities, whether you have the room to actually put them out into a pasture. And then if you're boarding, some of that is taken off of you. So maybe you have the land, but you don't want to deal with having to feed twice a day, every single day, having someone come in if you travel a lot, having to find someone to come in and feed your horse for you. It might be easier to say like, hey, I'm going to pay the price to have him boarded here. He's fed twice a day by the staff there. I can go out anytime I want. It's close or whatnot. So those are just things to think about. Honestly, before you buy is it's the best time to start thinking about it. I have seen people who buy a horse and goes, oh boy, where am I going to put it? And that's never a really good thing. So feed, what are you going to feed them? Always start with the pasture and the grass or the hay, whatever of those like forage feeds that you're going to feed them, those are going to make up the baseline of their nutrition. So that's where they're going to get most of their protein, most of their energy. All of that's going to come from the grass or the hay, whether they're pasture or stall boarded. Then you can look and see, okay, I'm working the horse every day. He is trying to get fit. You're trying to put muscle on him. So that's when you're going to start looking at different grains and different prepackaged feeds and that kind of stuff to add to their diet. So most of it is going to look a little bit more like this bottom corner here. The pelleted feeds. This is sweet feed, so it's got molasses added to it. Horses love it, but also just be aware that it's a much higher fat content for the horse. So it can also, if you're feeding excessively, it can also make your horse a little hot. So it's just a balancing act of what your horse needs, how much work they're doing. My horse gets fat looking at grain. So some horses might get a handful of grain every day. Some horses get 2 to 4 pounds of grain a day. And it really depends, once again, on what kind of work you're asking them to do. And then every horse is different on how easily they gain or lose weight. So those are going to be your top 2 things. And then look at your feed, know what you're feeding, and then know if they need extra minerals or supplements added. There are supplements for everything and anything. There are supplements for bones. There are supplements for eyes and coat. A lot of horses get flax seed added to their diet, so you can grind it or feed it whole. And that's supposed to help with their coat. Minerals, you can buy mineral blocks and put out in the field. A lot of people do that. Just look at them and make sure that you're actually getting one that has the minerals in it and not feeding just an overabundance of salt. They also make bagged minerals that you can put and just do a small scoop over the horse's food. So sometimes that might be easier depending on how many horses you have or where they're being kept, that kind of thing. So feet, there's a really old saying, I don't know if y'all have heard it, but it says no foot, no horse, which is pretty true. We're asking horses to put a lot of weight on a really little, honestly, really small structures. So it's really important to take care of their feet and to know if something happens or something goes wrong, that they're going to be able to recover from that and be able to keep working. So the basic rule of thumb is a farrier visit every 6 weeks. Some horses go longer than that. Some horses can go up to 8, maybe even a little longer, especially your barefoot horses are a little easier. And a lot of farriers will tell you, if you can keep your horse barefoot, do it. It's easier price-wise. It's just a little easier all the way around. They're faster. They're faster to do when the farrier comes out. All they have to do is trim and even them, versus if they're having to pull the shoes and reset the shoes every 6 weeks. So, and certain types of horseshoes get very expensive very quickly. So definitely talk to your farrier, see what is best. They're going to look at your horse's conformation. They're going to ask what kind of work it's going to be doing. So certain disciplines mean that they're going to need a little bit of different shoe. If they're going to be on pavement and concrete to trail ride or ride that kind of thing, then shoes are a little more necessary just to help with the concussion. So they come in all different shapes and sizes. So this is a little bit more of a normal horseshoe. That's kind of what everyone thinks of. They have bar shoes, which are just connected in the back. Some of them will have an additional pad right here. This is a borium shoe, so it has these additions right here. It's just to add a little bit of traction. Some horses need that. And then this in this corner is a glue-on shoe, which I've seen several horses in glue-ons over the past several years. I don't know if that was a thing that was just becoming more popular, or the thing with glue-ons is that they're supposedly less easy to pull. So if you have a horse that is consistently pulling shoes and you consistently have to get the farrier out to replace it, that might be an option. The only thing I would suggest to be aware of is that if your horse still manages to pull a glue on, then it can do quite a bit of damage. So I've seen a horse pull a glue on and there's literally nothing left of the outside of that hoof wall. So when you're stripping it, remember that like everything that's on the outside is protecting, is keeping in moisture, is protecting the inside of the hoof, which is really sensitive. And once that's gone, that hoof is going to take a year to regrow from the top to the bottom. So you're going to have to deal with keeping it healthy and making sure it doesn't crack or split for the next year while it grows back down and kind of heals itself. So once again, talk to your farrier. Every horse is different. Different farriers might tell you different things for your horse, but find a farrier that you trust and talk to them. And I can honestly just say follow their best advice because they normally know what's best. So the other part is the teeth. So bad teeth obviously cause lots of problems because that's what they're using to eat. A lot of times horses' teeth erupt out of their gums for most of their life. So because of that, they're wearing them down as they eat, but if their teeth don't match up perfectly, then they're going to wear unevenly. So they get what we call hooks and ramps. So this picture right here, that's the hook where it comes down in this point. And then that's the upper jaw. The bottom jaw is going to be fairly the same thing, and that's what we call a ramp. So once they do that, they get sore, they can hurt the inside of their mouth, they can cut it, and it makes them a little unwilling to eat. It makes their mouth sore, it makes them not want to eat, makes it hard to chew. So once they slow down their intake, then you're going to notice weight loss. You might notice trouble with them trying to take the bit. It's uncomfortable, it's painful. So at least once a year, I would have the horse's teeth checked and probably floated. So all that the vet is going to come out and do, they're probably going to sedate your horse, because once they put the speculum on, which is here, it's big, it's metal. If the horse backs up or if the horse slings its head, then you have a horse that's basically wearing a metal club. And it can be a little bit dangerous if you start slinging his head around. So your horse is probably going to be sedated. And they make these electric floats. They also make hand floats. Different people will use different things. And they're just going to go in and they're going to file down the rough edges off the horse's teeth to make sure that it's comfortable and they can eat. They're not going to take off excessively, especially as a horse gets older, because there does come a point when that tooth has finished erupting out of their gum line and that's all they're going to get. So especially as the horse gets older, they're going to be very vigilant of how much they're taking off, but the sharp points really do have to go. And most horses don't mind it super, especially if you work with them, they're really good about it. So vaccines, this is more of the preventative side of it. So we really have 4 or 5 core vaccines: Western and Eastern equine encephalitis, West Nile. Both of those are spread by parasites, and then rabies and tetanus, just like you would a dog or any other animal. And rabies is actually core, but at least last I checked, it's not required by law, but I would really say like these are your core ones. These are the ones you really have to get, and they come in a ton of different forms, whether they're a combination vaccine, individual vaccine. It really depends on what your horse's previous vaccination history is. So if you don't have the previous vaccination history, the best thing to do is start over. You're not going to hurt them by starting over. So most of these are annual vaccines, and then the first time you give them, you're going to give them a booster series, or sometimes some of them require 2 boosters. So, but these are your core ones, and then there are 100 other vaccines to consider. More of the popular ones, or more of the more necessary ones around here at least are Potomac horse fever, strangles, rhino, pneumonitis. Strangles and rhino, especially if you're showing or if you're at a boarding facility where they're touching noses with other horses, or they could be sharing food or water containers with other horses, which isn't really ideal, but it happens. That's the way things work. You're going to start thinking about strangles and rhino way more because those are really highly contagious. Botulism, in some cases, it's not really super, I wouldn't say super necessary, unless you're feeding round bales. And then even then, if you're getting high quality round bales, then it shouldn't be much of a problem. It's mostly concerning because sometimes if there's an animal or something has died in the field and it gets wrapped up in the hay, then the botulism can spread. That's where most people say that it comes from. I can't say that I know a whole lot of horses that get vaccinated for botulism, especially if you're feeding square bales or especially if they're in a stall. It's just not as necessary. You can also do lepto, you can do anthrax, different vaccines like that, but these are probably the more common ones. So deworming really depends on your horse. You can do a fecal egg count on the horse to find out their parasite load and how high of a shedder they are. So if you have a horse that's a really high shedder, you're probably going to deworm them 4 times a year. If your horse is a low shedder, the best thing to do is deworm them twice a year. So there's been an increasing problem with parasite resistance. It happens. We used to deworm every 4 months, every horse, no matter what, and it just started causing problems. So if you can get by with twice a year, that's definitely best. Look for something with ivermectin or moxidectin in it. Those are fairly wide covering dewormers. They're going to target most of the species that you're going to find in your horse. Just once a year, look for something that has plus or gold. I'm trying to think if there's one that says super. Any of those kind of extra words, those are what you're going to look for. They have praziquantel. I really hope I pronounced that correctly. But praziquantel basically targets the tapeworms. So ivermectin, moxidectin doesn't do as good of a job. So at least once a year, you're going to add that gold or that plus in there to make sure that you're protecting your horse against tapeworms as well. So TPR, or a temperature, pulse, respiration, just basic horse vital signs. They're not super hard to take, but they're really some of the most basic and important indicators that you're going to see that something isn't right with your horse other than, oh, he's acting strange. So this is the first thing you're going to do. And you always want to take your respiration first. That's because once you start getting in there, messing with him, trying to take his temperature, trying to take his pulse, most likely his respiration is going to change first. So you kind of want to stand back, watch him for a minute. You just count the breaths. Horses tend to have 8 to 16 breaths per minute. So it's pretty low compared to some species. And then their pulse is about 32 to 48 beats per minute. There are 2 or 3 different ways you can take it. If you have a stethoscope, that's great. Their heart rate you can find right below their elbow, or right behind their elbow rather, and just listen how many beats per minute it is. You can do 15-second intervals and then multiply by 4. If you don't have a stethoscope, that's fine. It just takes a little bit of practice. I would say probably, in my opinion, the easier one is right under the jaw. So that's right under the bone, and you'll go under, and you just have to feel around for it for a minute. But you can hold it just like you would take your pulse on your wrist. And you can also take a digital pulse, which is right below or right behind the fetlock of the horse's leg, and then you can look and feel. And I think that one's a little harder to feel or a little harder to find, simply because it's usually not super strong unless you're having some kind of problems like laminitis or something like that. So I would try, generally speaking, try for the jaw first. But know what's normal for your horse. These are fairly wide ranges. So if you have a horse who is really fit, they're going to have lower numbers. So your horse might have a normal respiration rate of 8 or 9, and you go out there and his respiration rate is 16, 17 beats per minute. His pulse is almost 50. And then you might be starting to question whether something is off, whereas if your horse isn't as fit, his normal might be at 48. So although it says, 48 is a normal pulse rate, maybe that's not for your horse. Maybe your horse's is a little lower because he is really fit. So just know what's normal for your horse. That way, if something comes up, you can automatically say like, yes, his pulse rate is high, or yes, his respiration is high. Temperature across the board is 99 to 101 or 101 and a half. They have a higher body temperature than humans. So it's always taken rectally. It's really easy. But if they have a fever, then that's the first kind of cause for concern that it might be something that's contagious. So if they have a fever and you know something isn't right, then I might start thinking about calling the vet, or just maybe putting them in a stall somewhere away from other horses in case it turns into something that's contagious. Because most of your really contagious diseases or viruses start out with a fever. So, and once again, just know what's normal for your horse, because you're going to know how they act, how they normally act, and then you're going to be able to see when something isn't right. First aid kit, everyone has different things in their first aid kit. It really varies from person to person. This is kind of more of the core aspects. Some people have really huge first aid kits. Some people just keep very, very basic stuff in there. It does not have to be elaborate. If you're boarding, a lot of barns will have one there. I would always suggest keeping one if you have a tack trunk or wherever you keep your supplies, keeping one with you just in case, because you know what you need and you know what you want. And community first aid kits have a horrible habit of just what you need is not there. So they have a tendency to be a little bit slow to replenish their supplies. But it never hurts to have your own. And this is just a little bit of an overview of kind of the more common things to put in it. So obviously bandaging supplies, vet wrap, roll cotton, the elasticon, which is the really stretchy stuff, and then gauze and telfa pads. So I wouldn't put gauze directly over an open wound because it can stick. It's got the fibers in it and it can stick. So telfa are those like nice non-stick pads, and you can buy them at the pharmacy. Same thing you would use for humans. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. And then just put the gauze over it before you start rolling it. If you don't know how to bandage, I would really strongly suggest either getting someone to show you if you're at a boarding barn, or you know someone else who has horses. Get someone to show you. If not, a lot of the vet schools have really good videos out there on how to bandage different parts of the legs, because it can be a little picky, and if it's done incorrectly, it can actually cause probably, I would argue, more damage than what the initial wound would cause, simply because it can put a lot of stress on the tendons in the horse's leg. So make sure when your horse gets a gash on its leg, that's probably not the best time to be learning to bandage, but just look up some videos or have someone come in and show you how to bandage the different parts of a horse's leg, whether it's up higher on the hock where you're going to have to be more careful of the joint, or whether it's down on the leg where you can apply a little bit more pressure. But just make sure you have a good understanding of how to do it. And then I would also maybe even add to this duct tape, which sounds a little weird, but you use duct tape on hooves. If you ever have a hoof that you need to wrap, then duct tape makes great boots to put around the bottom of the hoof to make sure that the packing stays in place. I have also heard that in a pinch, diapers work wonders. I have never tried it, but I've even heard vets say, like, if you don't have nothing else, use a diaper because they're going to work. So I would also suggest some kind of antibiotic cream. A lot of the ones made for horses are silver-based, but you can also honestly use Neosporin, like a triple antibiotic ointment, just like we would use. Just make sure you have wooden tongue depressors or something like that that you can spread it on with. But it can be one of the equine specific products or something like we would use for humans, as long as it has that antibiotic property in it. Magna paste or Epsom salts. These are both Epsom salts, but the Magna is a thick green paste and it's used more almost as a poultice. So you would apply it on a leg or on a hoof where you have an abscess, whereas an Epsom salt you would make more of a soak. So you can soak a hoof that has an abscess or something like that. Those are pretty common, especially when the ground gets really wet. So you'll see a lot more hoof abscesses. So it's really a good idea to keep something around to soak a hoof in if you need to, or Magna paste if you have like other areas of soreness or things like that. Bute is one of those things that a lot of different people will tell you a lot of different things about. It's basically the horse form of ibuprofen. So it's a pain reliever. It's anti-inflammatory, and There is a risk, just like ibuprofen poses a small health risk to humans. If you use it incorrectly, it will say on the bottle, like, this product can cause like X, Y, and Z if used excessively. Bute has the same thing. It can cause, or it can contribute to ulcers and things like that. So a lot of people can be really hesitant to use Bute. That's up to you. It's up to your personal opinion. Mine is, if I did a workout and I was sore or I wasn't feeling well, I would take ibuprofen, and I would, same with my horse, if I knew that he was sore or if I thought he had a sore muscle, I probably wouldn't hesitate to give him Bute, as long as you're not giving it excessively and as long as you're following the dosing instructions on it. I don't really think you're going to have a problem, and I would rather give the Bute and kind of let the soreness work out and let your horse feel better versus making him stand there and just deal with it. And once again, that's something that people have different opinions about, and that just has to be up to you about how often you want to use it, or in which cases you want to use it. Saline is a really good rinse. You can go to the contact aisle in Walmart and buy a bottle of saline. Anything like that works. You can also buy it, once again, from equine specific sites. You can find it anywhere. It's not super expensive. It makes a good wash to rinse out an eye if you ever need to. Smaller wounds, I think you're fine to rinse out with. If you have a larger wound, I would honestly go for a water hose, simply because you're going to be pouring a lot of saline on it. And you can definitely use saline a little bit if you want, if you think that it's going to help. But when it comes to a large open wound that you're just trying to get cleaned up, honestly, a water hose, yes, it's not sterile, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just rinse and rinse and rinse the wound. And it really depends on the situation, but you can always flush wounds with saline for the most part. Syringes, so especially if you are planning to keep saline around as a wound, as something to flush wounds with, I would keep a large dosing syringe. So like the kind you would give oral medication with, in case you ever needed to give oral medication. But I would also keep it around to use as a tool to use if you ever want to flush a wound, or if you need to get somewhere small and need to kind of flush that area out. It's definitely helpful. Scissors, just because you're keeping bandaging supplies. Gloves, simply because it's blood and you might not really know what's in the wound, and you just don't want that on you or in a place where you could spread that. So I would say if there's blood, go ahead and put gloves on, is always just best practice. And then your vet contact information. I know most people have it in their phone, but if your horse ever comes in with a huge gash on them, or if something's really wrong really quickly, something will happen. Like, you're not going to be able to find it, or you might have to borrow someone else's phone. You might have left yours at the house or in the truck or something. So I will always have a card with your vet's contact and the emergency after hours number. It's also helpful if you're gone, if someone else is taking care of your horses and something happens, they pull out the first aid kit and the information is already there. It just makes things flow a lot easier, especially in an emergency situation. So I would definitely consider having the contact information in there. I think that's pretty necessary. You might also consider Banamine, which is a little bit of a stronger anti-inflammatory than Bute. Is normally used, like if your horse is colicking, your vet is probably going to ask you the first thing, like, do you have Banamine? Can you give Banamine? That kind of thing. So it can be given, they do make oral Banamine. It can be given orally. A lot of times I've seen it given IV, an IV version, just because it's much faster absorbing. But once again, if you're not comfortable or you're not sure how to give IV medications, then it's definitely best to stick with oral or something that you're more comfortable with. It just keeps the situation a lot less stressful and a lot safer. So really quick, just because I think, or let me go back, one more thing I'll say about this. If your horse is shod, so if you have shoes on your horse, I would also recommend having a pair of shoe pullers, or at least a pair of really sturdy pliers, and know how to pull a shoe. So a sprung shoe is an emergency. If they have that's half on, half off, if it's flipping around, if it's somewhere where they can turn it and step on it and it goes into the sole of their hoof, it can cause a lot of problems really quickly. So it's always best to kind of keep something around where you can pull that shoe if necessary. I would not leave it on. If you call your farrier is definitely going to take it off anyway. And having your horse stand around in something that's not secure could lead to injury. So keep something, if your horse has shoes, I would recommend keeping something that you have where you can pull the shoe if you absolutely have to. And then colic, I'm going to spend just a minute on this. I do not want that to play yet, just because it's something I think every horse owner, unfortunately, will probably see a mild case at least at some point. It happens. It's super common. It's the #1 medical cause of death in horses. So I have seen horses colic, and I've seen it from very mild to very severe. I've seen horses put down over it. But broadly, a lot of people think it's a disease or some specific something. It's not. It's just abdominal pain. Anything that's causing that horse abdominal pain is a colic. So it could be very mild. It could be something that resolves itself in a few hours. Maybe you do give him Banamine and he starts feeling better and it kind of resolves itself. That happens. But it can also lead to surgical situations, or it can lead to situations where you end up having to euthanize the animal. So it can be caused gas, impaction colic, so something is actually impacting the intestines, so nothing is moving through. It can be caused by twists. Almost anything you can imagine can cause a colic. There are strangulations, so it's really hard to tell what's causing a colic until your vet gets out there and does an examination. But some of the really early things to look for, some of the more like classic things to look for, is if your horse is pawing the ground a lot, if he's trying to roll, if he's getting down and getting back up again and getting down again, kind of rolling over. If he's biting or looking at his flank, or he's trying to kick his flank, is kind of saying that he's hurting or he's uncomfortable. If he's in an area where you can watch him, or if you're bringing him in to watch him, watch and see if he's passing manure. If he's not able to pass feces, then that's a really good sign that something's up. And then also look at his abdomen and see if he's bloated. So if he's really tight and bloated, that's also a really good sign that something is definitely wrong. Once again, some of these signs, some colics, they don't present very quickly or very severely, but it can turn severe quick. So just know what's normal for your horse. Again, I feel like that's just the best advice, to give time and time again, know what's normal, because then you're going to be able to pick up when something's not, that a normal person might not on your horse. So colic is, I would say, always one of those things where you want to call your vet. I can't think of any vet who is ever going to be sorry or angry or upset that you called them over a suspected colic that turned out to be nothing, because it's much better, one of those much better safe than sorry situations more often than not. And more often than not, they're going to ask, like, what have you done? Or they're going to tell you, like, to give Banamine if you have Banamine. It can give you a couple different options. So I have a video really quick, if it will play. And this is just some of the more classic colic signs. So it's normal for horses to roll. Horses can definitely roll, but you can tell whether they're doing it because they're happy and they just want to roll on the ground versus something is wrong and they're in pain. So like it says, depression, dullness, if your horse just acts really depressed or like something's not right, then most likely than not, something's not right. And you'll see this in a minute. He's kind of over and over, and he's not he's not very energetic. So he's kind of getting up and laying back down. And you'll look here in a second, he'll actually turn around and he'll kind of try to nip at his flank. So there he goes. He's kind of looking back, and it looks like he's painful. So some of those things, those are really the more obvious ones, the easier ones to spot. So, and like I said, if you see that, I would definitely call the vet and be like, hey, I think something is wrong, because they're always going to come out. They're not going to be upset that something didn't turn out, and it can get pretty severe pretty quickly. A lot of people say, and I have heard it all my life, don't let them down, don't let them roll. It's going to cause their intestines to twist. So the general rule, or the general advice that I have always heard given my entire life, is get them up and walk them. Don't let them stop. Walk them back and forth and back and forth. And whether that's really sound advice, it is never going to hurt your horse. So I would definitely say, like, if that's what you're more comfortable doing, go for it. Get them up, walk them. But it's not necessary in all cases. Whether or not it's going to twist their intestines or cause a worse problem really depends on the type and the severity of the colic. So sometimes I've also heard it said, if the horse is lying down and they look like they're more comfortable lying down, let them lie. once again, I grew up hearing like, don't let them walk them. It really depends on what you're more comfortable with. Ask your vet. Your vet's probably going to have an opinion in the moment, depending on how they've been acting, how severe it is. I've also heard for certain kinds of colic, loading them up in the trailer and taking them for a trailer ride is going to help. And it has. In some cases, it has, just not all kinds of colic. Unfortunately, a lot of colics, you don't really know why they what happens to them until either the vet comes out and they look at them, or sometimes not even until the horse has already been euthanized and they do an autopsy and is like, yes, this is what happened. A lot of times you never know. Sometimes they just go back to normal, happy-go-lucky, and everything's great and everything's fine. So, but that's actually all I have. It went much faster than I anticipated. I apologize. That might be a good thing. But are there any questions? Like I said, this was very basic for the most part, but I would be more than happy to answer anything if you want me to go more in depth on something or you're confused about something. So.
Thank you, Emily. That was great. Enjoyed that. And if anybody has questions, you should be able to unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat box. One thing that I wanted to ask Emily is finding a farrier. I know most people find those word of mouth, but is there an association or some kind of trusted way to find one, or word of mouth? Is that still the best way?
So I personally, I would always go word of mouth. I think I have found that most people find someone they trust and they want to tell people about them. But farriers are really interesting. They're kind of one of the trades that still use a guild system. So a lot of people apprentice. There are a couple different organizations, there are a couple different associations that farriers will get certified in. It's not required by law. The different apprenticeships, things like that. So not all of them are going to be that way. It's a little bit of, don't want to call it an odd system, but a little bit of a different system as to how they go about certification, and that kind of thing is mostly voluntary. So we can definitely find one that way.
Okay. Great. Lots of kudos here in the chat box. I don't know if you're accessing those, but great job. Great presentation. Very good.
I apologize for talking fast. I think I was
no,
probably a little more nervous than I thought I was going into this, so I apologize if I
didn't show it off. It did really well.
But no, thank everybody.
All right. Well, if there are no questions, again, thank you, Emily, and this will be recorded. If I can figure out how to share this at some point, we'll send a link, maybe in a 5-Point Friday or maybe Shad's YouTube site. Dale had asked, does this info apply to mules as well?
A lot of it. I can't say that I've dealt a lot with mules. I'd say at least for the most part, and this is speculation, so I wouldn't take total accuracy on it, but I would say most of it. They're equids, they're half horse. So I would definitely say for the most part that you're going to run into a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same problems. I definitely know you can shoe mules. And I'm assuming, once again, total assumption, I'm assuming that I would probably still get their teeth checked. I would still deworm them. I would still look into vaccines, that kind of thing. So most of the basic care is going to be the same.
Okay.
They're just a lot more stubborn.
Okay. Thank you. All right. If there are no other questions, again, thank you, Emily, and thank all of you for tuning in. And Shad, on Thursday evening, it's going to be Rick Bessend again. Is that correct? Talking about garden insects.
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So thank you all, and you all have a great evening.
Good job, Emily.
Thank you. Now, can you help me figure out, I am screen sharing, how do I get back to actually exit out of the Zoom meeting?
Let's see.